Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are joining us all. Welcome to the Catholic University Bush School CEO lecture. This is our first online CEO lecture. Normally we host these in our beautiful De La Rada auditorium in the Maloney Hall building, but courtesy of the coronavirus, we're doing it online. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Jeff Cherry. Jeff is a graduate of the Catholic University, 82 bachelors in architecture, 85 masters in architecture. Jeff played both lacrosse and football at Catholic. Over the last 30 years, he's been a designer, CEO, educator, consultant, and investor. He's the founder of the Porter Group, CEO of Shift Ventures, and founder and executive director of the Conscious Venture Lab. Jeff is a champion for the transformation of capitalism. He works with private investors and early stage businesses with the goal of creating businesses that are operating at the intersection of profit and purpose. He's currently bringing these experiences together to help companies develop more conscious, purpose-driven business models and to help investors build societal as well as financial value. Jeff is also a founding partner of the Laudato Si Startup Challenge. This is inspired by Pope Francis. It's a global initiative, a call to action that encourages early to mid-stage startups to grow their breakthrough solutions to the world's boldest challenges. Jeff describes himself as a recovering NCAA Division III football player, but he's also has a black belt in Taekwondo and is currently studying Krav Maga, which is the martial art and defense system developed by the Israeli Defense Forces. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Jeff Cherry. Over to you, Jeff.
Hey, Dean. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with everyone else out there in Cyberland, wherever you are from. I hope you guys can hear me. If you have any problems, please just let Samantha know, and she will connect with me. So let's get right into it. We're going to talk, if I can get the slide to work, there we go. We're going to talk a little bit today about what I call the power of purpose and the future of work. We'll get into what's happening in society with this whole pandemic, and a little bit about how maybe what you think about business, everything you thought about business might be wrong. But to get started, as Dean Abella said, I am a proud graduate of the Catholic University of America. As many of you are on the line, I actually was looking through some of the folks that were joining, and I think there might be a teammate or two of mine on the line. So happy to be here with all of you. One thing that you'll hear throughout this presentation is that lots of the business I've done over the years included other grads from Catholic, people I met, and relationships that were developed from my freshman year that I have are still strong and resilient, and working with many of those folks today. So just something to take heed of. I graduated, as Dean Abella said, undergrad in 82 and grad school in 85, and then with degrees in architecture. And I was crazy enough to think that I could start my own firm. I actually was in an office with a few other professors who were teaching at Catholic, but I started my own architectural firm in 1986. About a year after I got out of school, I spent a little bit of time down in Rehoboth Beach, tending bar, taking some time off, but then came back to DC and actually was asked by a friend of mine from high school to design a restaurant for him, is how I started the business. And I started that business with another grad from architecture school, a guy by the name of Spence Bowling. But when we started the business, it was, a pretty interesting time. It was sort of the beginning of the Star Architects movement. So Frank Gehry was just coming of age, and we were trying to figure out how to compete, two very, young guys who were 26 years old, how to compete in that environment. And I was always sort of an amateur follower of Winston Churchill. And once Churchill once said, first we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. He was talking about the House of Commons after the Blitzkrieg and whether they would rebuild. But he really didn't understand, or maybe he did, but how true that was. During that time, when we first started the firm, we had done some work with a group out of San Diego called the Academy for Neuroscience and Architecture. And they were studying the impact of the physical environment on the brain. And we started to think about how to use a building as a tool for performance. We were doing a lot of work for corporate clients at the time. And one of the things we found pretty early in our careers and when I started the business was our corporate clients really didn't care about what we did. They cared about what they did. And if we weren't able to help them get better at what they did, we weren't going to be successful. So we started to think about how we could use the physical environment to drive behavior. So thinking about the impact of the environment on the brain, how we could use that to craft the environment to get the employees of our clients to behave in a fashion that was aligned with strategy. So we started to think more about ourselves as more of a consulting company. And then in 1989, we had a bunch of clients that started coming to us and asking us, hey, what do you guys know about this thing? I think it's called a personal computer. And I know that tells a little bit about how old I am. But we sort of scratched our heads and said, we don't know anything about it. We're designers and architects. But we got the question asked enough times that we figured that we should investigate why we were getting people coming to us asking us about technology. And what we found is that they were asking really simple questions about light and heat and air and those sorts of things. I mean, back in the day, we had clients, they were thinking about the PC was just a mainframe, only smaller. But we started to talk to some of the folks that we knew that were electrical engineers and computer scientists at Catholic, and they started to tell us about this thing that was coming called the internet. And they were saying essentially, those people are asking the wrong questions. The question they should be asking is if you're ever going to need an office again, and if so, why? And if you start thinking about what Howard Schultz started with Starbucks, thinking about the third place, that the whole emergence of technology was going to change the way that we were thinking about everything we were doing in the office space. So that became pretty interesting to us, and we started to hire people, and we actually brought on a partner, a guy by the name of Joe Logue, who some of you might know, to start helping us think about technology and how it was going to impact our business. One more thing happened during this time frame is that I had a friend who was working on Wall Street, and he called me and he said, hey, this firm, Andersen Consulting, well, they hired 100 architects in their New York office. And what do you know about that? So again, sort of scratched our heads and said, we have to do a little research. And what we found, it was sort of the beginning of the design thinking movement, where the consulting agencies were thinking that as designers, this group of people knew how to solve problems, architects that is, knew how to solve problems in a way that was pretty unique, but they didn't have access to the C-suite as the consulting companies did. So they were doing an experiment to see if they could disintermediate that whole industry. The experiment didn't work out very well for Andersen Consulting. They went out of business, and there were some cultural issues there. But we've also found that very interesting that we agreed that there was a way to think about solving problems that we had a unique perspective on. So in addition to then, the technology group that we had started and the architectural practice that we had then, we started to hire some other folks that were doing things around management consulting and organizational development. So at the end of this, we had sort of this Venn diagram of a company that we're trying to bring these three things together: the physical environment, the technological environment, the cultural environment, as a way to essentially redefine how our clients thought about the environment, and use all of these three pieces to help them craft an environment that would drive strategically aligned behavior. So it was an interesting time, and this is a story that goes over about 20 years. So we're going quickly through it so we can get to some more interesting things to talk about today. But as we grew this business on the consulting side, we started to get some interesting questions from some of our corporate clients. We were doing work for government agencies. We did a lot of work for the Navy, but we also had a bunch of corporate clients that we were doing work for. And we started to get some interesting questions from them. I just got a message, so I was a little distracted, but I'll keep going. And those questions were based on sort of two things. One set of questions were money questions. Can you help us drop costs and raise revenue? As a consulting practice, not an unusual question. But there was another group of clients that were coming to us and asking us a whole different set of questions about people, about the nature of their relationships. So how do I get my employees to give a damn about this place like I do? How do I get my suppliers to feel like partners and not like servants? How do I get communities to welcome us in and not put up barriers to entry? And most importantly, how do I get my customers to understand that I have their best interest at heart, and we want to be in a relationship and not just a transaction? So though it was interesting to us because those companies that were asking us those questions were doing really incredible things in the world. So the punchline to all that is, if I want you to care about me, I should care about you first. So today we say that those companies were creating what we call cultures of caring. We didn't know what to call it at the time, but we just saw it happening. It was the emergence of what we now call conscious capitalism. Again, we didn't have a name for it. We just saw it happening. And lo and behold, that generally those clients that were coming to us and asking us those questions, not only were they doing great things in the world, but they were performing very well. They were making a lot of money. So that's something that sort of stuck with us. And at the same time, we had been working with a guy by the name of Raj Sisodia. Raj was a professor at Bentley College in Massachusetts. He's now teaching at the entrepreneurship school at Babson. And Raj had been doing work with us on marketing. He's a marketing professor. And we were doing lots of work on customer perception of value. And Raj came to us one day and said, hey, at this time I was working with another Catholic U grad, so a guy by the name of Rick Frazier, who was on the consulting side of our business. And Raj said, I've been working on this idea in my MBA class. And the idea was just to have MBA students going out and talking to customers at the point of sale and asking them, tell us about a company that you love and why do you love them? And he said, you guys are going to find this interesting because we keep getting the same names over and over again. People seem to love Whole Foods. They seem to love Starbucks. They seem to really love Chipotle. They want to fly Southwest Airlines. They love Honest Tea. And he said, not only are we hearing the same things over and over again, but the deeper we get into the research, we're finding that it's not just customers that love these companies. Employees want to work there. Suppliers want to do business with them. Communities want them in their community. And so we were speaking with Raj and said, yeah, this is exactly what we're seeing on the ground. Well, that research turned into a manuscript, which Rick and I worked on with Raj for about 2 years. And that manuscript turned into a book called Firms of Endearment. that was an inspirational book about how there was a new narrative being developed in capitalism, that it wasn't just about the money, that the businesses that were emerging as truly the most successful were finding ways to solve problems and engage all of their stakeholders. Subsequent to that, Raj wrote another book, which you may have heard of, called Conscious Capitalism, that Raj wrote with John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods. The Conscious Capitalism, Firms of Endearment, came out around 2004, and around that time, Rick and I had started thinking about what we wanted to do next, and we had become really enamored with this idea that there was a new story being told around capitalism, that the most successful companies were going to be those companies that found a way to care for all their stakeholders. And you have to remember, this is 2004, so we'd been through September 11, we'd been through the WorldCom and Enron debacles, financial fraud. So we were trying to figure out how that we fit into this whole stew of things that was going on, because we are dyed-in-the-wool capitalists. But capitalism was getting a bad name, and in some ways for really good reasons. So we decided that the best way for us to support those companies that were thinking differently was to sort of go into the lion's den. So we sold the company in 2006, a consulting company, and we started a hedge fund. I moved back to New York. We started a company called the Consinity Group. Consinity is a word that came from Firms of Endearment. That means bringing together various parts to create elegant harmony. And Raj said that the companies that were operating with this stakeholder mindset were in a state of consinity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that went later on, but I want to get to one other thing. We ran that fund. I worked with Rick in that fund for about 6 years. Rick actually still runs that fund in New York. But during that time, we had been talking about what was our real goal. And for me, I was looking for a way really to transform the way people felt and thought about capitalism. And while the hedge fund was required in the capital stack, I didn't think it was going to be the thing that was going to be a catalyst. I think that the catalyst needed to be a grassroots movement, that we needed to start this from the ground up. So we had been kicking around this idea for quite a while within the firm. And then I decided that that's really what I wanted to do. So in 2012, I left the fund and I started this thing called Conscious Venture Lab, which is an accelerator and a venture capital fund that focuses on investing in and training entrepreneurs to build this whole stakeholder or conscious mindset into the DNA of their business. So that's sort of where I am now. And the one thing that's really unique about this is sort of, why is this business idea, this idea that we can create successful businesses, so outside of the norm, I guess I would say. And we've been sort of kicking that around for a long time. And we think that there's some background to why we ended up where we are. We're even there today. So I'll ask this as a question, and if anyone knows, we'll figure out some sort of prize. But if you know what the significance of this date, September 13, 1970, write it in the chat, and we'll talk more about it later on the questions and answer. But on this day, there was an article written in the New York Times Magazine, written by a guy named Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman said, there's one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase profits, so long as it does so within the law, without deception or fraud. And from that point forward, for the next, we'll say 50 years, we were on a path. The academic and financial models that came after this started down this path to think about that the purpose of business was to create value for shareholders. That certainly has been taught in business schools, the University of Chicago, and business schools around the world since that day. It wasn't always like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But then something else happened almost 50 years later to the day, again in the New York Times, August 19th of last year. And this came out at about 9 a.m. on the New York Times website, and the time is significant, and you'll see why in a moment. On that day, a group called the Business Roundtable, which is a group of 200 of the largest and most successful businesses in the United States, came out with a statement that changed the way that they had been talking about the purpose of business for the last 50 years. That statement partly said we share a fundamental commitment to all of our stakeholders. Each is essential, and we commit to deliver value for all of them for the future success of our companies and our communities and our country. So this whole notion of that the purpose of business was not just about the money, and in fact, we should be focusing on the well-being of all of our stakeholders. Well, we were obviously pretty happy to see this statement come out, and since then, this idea is gaining more and more traction. But on the day it came out, I asked Rick, my old partner, how long do you think it will be before the Wall Street Journal comes out with a rebuttal? And he said, no, maybe 2 or 3 days, maybe a week. Well, at 5:09 that evening, the Wall Street Journal came out with an op-ed, stakeholder CEOs, executives who abandon shareholders won't appease the socialists. And it continued from there. And 5:50 that day, 6:55 that day, 7:15, and even into the days following, where the status quo on Wall Street jumped on the bandwagon to push back on this as an idea. The interesting thing about that is that this idea is not new. The idea that we should be focused on something other than the money has been around since as long as 1954. Peter Drucker said it's management's public responsibility to put whatever is generally in the public good to make that become the enterprise's own self-interest. So this whole divergence that we've been going through, it's not how business has been run forever. So I've spent the last 15 years of my career trying to figure out how to change this narrative, why we are where we are. And the interesting thing is there's a paradox of purpose. And I said we talk a little bit more about the performance of the hedge fund. But let's get into, first of all, when Raj wrote Firms of Endearment, we did some analysis on the companies. And remember, Raj was a marketing professor. And he wrote the book it started out as an idea about how these companies were engaging with stakeholders. He didn't start the book thinking about performance. But in the middle of the reading the manuscript, Rick and I said, we should have someone take a look at the performance of these companies and see how they've done. And you can see here on the screen that we had a friend of ours who was a quant trader at Citibank in New York, and he did some analysis. And when he first called us, we figured maybe these companies would perform at market or a little bit lower. But what you see is that these companies that are thinking differently about the practice of capitalism, they're outperforming the markets by leaps and bounds. And the longer you hold them, the better that performance gets. Now, we got pushback on that saying, well, that's an academic study. It's a one-off. You can make back tests, say anything you want. And some of that's true. But then we started a hedge fund based on this idea. And you have to remember, we had two guys that came from Catholic. We had never been on Wall Street. We started a hedge fund. We had some ideas about how to analyze companies, but we weren't traders. We weren't Wall Street guys. We started the fund. We started the research for the fund in 2006, and we started trading in 2008. And if you've heard about the great financial crisis, we could not have picked the worst time to start a hedge fund, except our ideas proved out to be pretty successful. That even in the worst economy that we've known up until now, perhaps, investing in these companies that were thinking differently about business, we were able to outperform the market. And finally, we've launched another product that we call the Customer Value Index that really focuses on how companies engage authentically with customers. And we're finding the same thing there, that these companies that are not myopically focused on the bottom line are finding ways to create value for all of their stakeholders. Not only do they do great things in the world, but they're generally more successful. So why is this? So one of the reasons we think, or I think the main reason we think, is this idea of shareholder myopia. And that we think that oftentimes managers and executives who are focused on the old narrative about business, that the purpose of business is to create value for shareholders, they do so to the detriment of all the other stakeholders that are required by the organization to create value. So what they actually erode long-term corporate performance by focusing on short-term financial performance. This has been shown over and over again, and we think this is one of the reasons why this notion of stakeholder capitalism and managing your business for stakeholders is starting to gain some traction. And as I said, I've been working on this now for a long time and trying to sort of figure out how do we continue to change this narrative. And then everything changed. Everything changed. The entire world has changed now with the coronavirus and COVID-19. We are in really unprecedented times, and it's impacting everyone. Obviously, it's impacting people's lives. From a health standpoint, but it's really showing how we aren't prepared for. We weren't resilient, both from civil society, from financial, from capitalism. That we've got a long way to go. And I think that we're at a crossroads because things are not going to go back to the way they were, or we're going to experience a new normal when we come out of this. And I think the question that I'm asking myself, and I hear other people, entrepreneurs that we work with, other venture capital funds that we work with, is that what's it going to be like when we get to the other side of this? What are we going to care about when this is all over? Are we going to go back to business as usual and it's going to be all about the money? Or are we going to change the way that we think about businesses? Are we going to go to business for humanity? I'm not sure that I have the answer. But I think that we have to start thinking about how do we create a more resilient society and a more resilient economy. I think that that's clear if you just look around and see where things are today. As I said, we weren't prepared for this in many ways. So how are we going to create that more resilient environment? And what role should business play, since we are talking in the context of a business school? As I said, I'm not sure I have any answers, but I have a couple of things that I want you to all consider. One of the things that to focus on right now is crisis breeds innovation. So how are we going to innovate to make sure that both our society and economic infrastructures are resilient enough to care for us all during the next pandemic? The picture up on the screen right now is a picture from the Freddie Gray riots in Baltimore. And when we think about the idea that crisis breeds innovation, when we were going through this, and I had started the Conscious Venture Lab, and we were located out in Columbia, Maryland, and I had become very good friends with Stephanie Rawlings Blake, who was the mayor of Baltimore at the time. And I saw what was going on in the city, and I said to her, this really isn't about Freddie Gray. Freddie, it was a shame that what happened to that young man in the back of a police van, and you have a problem with policing. But a lot of this is about the way that you have been investing or not investing in minority communities in this city for the last 70 or 100 years. And she agreed with that. And based on that, in the middle of this crisis, we made a pivot and chose an innovation. We moved the Conscious Venture Lab from the suburbs into the middle of the city, into West Baltimore, in fact, right across the street from where this picture was taken, and started to focus on investing in minority and female founders as a way to see if we could help heal the city. So we think that this notion that crisis breeds innovation is real, and we should be thinking about how we are going to innovate during this period to be in a better position for the next big shock that we're bound to experience. I think the next thing I'd like you to think about is what value will we place on humanity? There are lots of signs of change, lots of good signs. Companies are stepping up and taking care of their employees. There's companies that are putting programs in place to help their customers and their suppliers through this time. And I see more and more of it every day. But I'm also a little bit concerned that all of these people and companies doing the right thing are being hailed as extraordinary, when perhaps they should be more commonplace, when perhaps we should be thinking about our common humanity, even when it comes to business. So this is something we've been contemplating, and I put forth for all of you to think a little bit about more as well. I think the final thing I want to put out there as an idea is that startups and small businesses are really the economic soul of our country. From an economic development standpoint, you see businesses all the time going, or not businesses, but communities all the time going out and trying to steal the big business from the next community. So can we get Lockheed Martin to move from Northern Virginia to Maryland? Or can we get Amazon, HQ2 to come to our town? But the statistics are pretty stark that all net new jobs are created by small businesses and startups. So this is a time when we really need to be leaning in and supporting those businesses. And it's hard to do when the economy is in such bad shape, when the economy is essentially shut down. But I think if we don't do those things, that we're going to be, we are likely to experience this personal and societal resilience in the same way as we are now, and not able to overcome it. There's going to be some great companies that are going to be founded during this time to help us get through the next pandemic or the next cultural shock, but that won't happen if we don't support them. So I want to wrap up here, and then we'll jump into some questions and answers. But this is something that we truly believe, that nothing has ever changed the world like a motivated entrepreneur. Business and capitalism is the greatest force for human cooperation and improvement yet devised. We haven't seen a system that works as well, and it must evolve. We can't stay stagnant. We can't stay, as society evolves, the way that we think about capitalism and business must evolve. And I think we're presented now with an opportunity to turn capitalism into something new, into an instrument of humanity, and not simply something that's all about generating profit. But if we take on this idea of business as a tool of humanity, I think that is a path to more profitable, more sustainable, more just, more joyous societies and businesses. So I'm going to leave you with this as a final a thing to think about as you sit around in quarantine and think about what you're going to do on the other side of this. What kind of world could we create if executives, entrepreneurs, and investors all decided that our first duty in business was simply to care for each other, and that care done well was truly the path to profit, sustainability, resiliency, equity for all? So Samantha and Dina Bella, with that, I will turn it back over to you and see if there are any questions. And thank you guys all for spending the time with me today and listening to my story, a little bit of my story.
Thank you, Jeff. Can you hear me?
I can.
Good. So there's a bunch of questions that have been coming through the chat box, but to save you having to look through for them, I will just read them off to you. So there was a question, could you give a definition of conscious capitalism?
Yeah. So the basic definition of conscious capitalism is a system of capitalism that takes into account the needs of all stakeholders, and not just as a tool to generate value for shareholders. Shareholders are a stakeholder, but as a means, as an end to themselves. So we think about this whole idea is that, we have suppliers, we have partners, we have investors, we have communities, we have customers, we have employees, that conscious businesses are, first of all, based on a broader societal purpose. They care for the needs of all of those stakeholders. They try to develop a culture of caring. And that is a way towards creating greater value, not only for shareholders, but also for society. So it's a new narrative about the purpose of business, really.
I like the way so it's a new narrative, but you connect it to the older Peter Drucker narrative. So you're saying that this is not entirely new. We're sort of correcting some crazy direction we went into, sort of. Is that yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun in some ways, right?
Right.
If you go back and you think about, look, Peter Drucker, one of my favorite quotes from Peter Drucker has always been, companies don't make money. Companies make shoes or lamps or computers, right? And if they do a good job at that, and they do a good job at making their own means, their own ends connected to society, then shareholders will be rightly rewarded. But if they focus myopically on shareholders, sometimes we say that if we focus myopically on shareholders and we separate purpose from profit, we leave a space in the middle for bad things to happen.
Right. One of the things that stuck out for me in your presentation just now, Jeff, was I think basically what you're saying is that conscious capitalism is capitalism that actually works, because it's not contrary to capitalism, right? It's not hostile to capitalism, which is what the Wall Street Journal seems to want to suggest. Right?
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. Is that sometimes when we say conscious capitalism, and you've been exposed to this a great deal, Dean. So we say conscious capitalism and people hear the conscious and they forget about the capitalism, right? That what we're trying to, one of your old professors, Ed Freeman, said to me, the solution to capitalism run amok is not socialism. It's a better form of capitalism, one that knocks off the rough edges and takes care of all of us. So yeah, we think that, in fact, at the hedge fund, Rick has gone away from talking about conscious capitalism. He talks about the multi-stakeholder operating system and basically says, look, these are just better run businesses. They're just better managed businesses, right? They take great care of their employees, so their employees give them discretionary effort. They take great care of their suppliers, so suppliers bring them innovations. They're really good in the community, so communities don't put up barriers to entry, which are expensive, right? They take great care of customers, so customers give them the benefit of the doubt when things go bad. And things always go bad at one point or the other, right? So it's all of that, sort of in a model.
So what would you say to somebody who said that conscious capitalism is an attack on private property, on shareholder rights?
Yeah, I think that, look, I go back to something that Ed Freeman said to me again at one point. He said, look, people don't have to agree with us about why you should do this. But if only thing you care about is making more money, you should do it anyway. because in fact, the companies that operate with this mindset are more successful. I think that there is, in some ways, the establishment, the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street establishment pushes back against this, against their own better interests. Because if some of this is natural. If I have, Gallup has done a study over the last 15 years, and it's been pretty consistent, that employee engagement across the board, the United States and even worldwide, 70% of employees are either disengaged, which means they just don't care, or they're actively and highly disengaged, which means they're actively trying to sabotage the company. So conscious companies try to flip that, equation. And we ask people all the time, so how much better would it be if 70% of your employees were highly engaged? And if you could use this idea as a tool to get them more engaged, would that make you more successful? Generally, we think the answer is probably yes.
Right. With this, I think you hit right at the heart of what we're doing at the Bush School, right? The notion that if you strive to make as much money as you can, ironically, you typically don't make as much money as if you're striving to serve others and help others.
Exactly.
But if you're a greedy SOB who only cares about making as much money as you can, then you don't become the kind of person who is able to help others, right? So even if you want to do it, as Freeman said, you want to do it just for the sake of the money, you have to learn how to be the kind of person who cares about others, right? Otherwise, people will see right through you, right?
Oh, that's right. That's right. I mean, the thing that in our work at the Conscious Venture Lab, we use that a little tongue in cheek, but this is not easy. This is hard to do, right? I mean, operating your business with a stakeholder mindset, if it were easy, everyone would do it. It's difficult. It takes courage. It takes, from time to time, you have to make, uncomfortable decisions, right? So you're right. It's not easy to do, and you have to feel it. You have to get it in your heart. And it does go right to the heart of what you're trying to do and continue to do at the Bush School. I believe that, which is one of the reasons why you and I continue to try and deepen our engagement, because I think that we're totally aligned on that as an idea.
Very much so. I'm getting so caught up in this, I'm forgetting to look at the chat box to pick up some questions. So let me give you some questions from our audience. So somebody else, so this is directly about your Conscious Venture Lab. Somebody went to your website and noted that on your site, you say that you'll typically make a $100,000 investment for 8% of the company, of the startup. And that's significantly less than what most venture capitalists will take. So he's asking if this is financially sustainable for you.
Yeah, see, so we're what considered a seed or a pre-seed venture fund connected to an accelerator. We make a lot more investments than your typical venture capital fund for the amount of money. So we're investing in 10 to 20 companies a year. So that's one thing. The other thing is we spend a lot more time with our companies than do the typical venture capitalists. So we put them through a 16-week training program. We have hundreds of mentors and consultants that come in and work with us. So that we think that sort of de-risks our model a little bit. So the sustainability is we're not so much worried about being diluted because we're making bets on a lot of companies. We're working very closely with them. And, we're not investing a terribly large amount of money in each company. So we do, and the accelerator model has been pretty well tested around the world. So, we're looking to then pass those companies along to other venture capitalists who believe about the world the way that we do, to help them on this path. So, we think it is sustainable.
Good. Here's another question asking if you've seen examples among larger companies displaying conscious capitalist behavior in response to COVID-19.
Yeah, look, I think that there are certainly some out there. There are companies that are paying essentially for particularly for essential workers that have to come to work. They're paying bonuses. There's some companies that are paying their employees to stay home. It's a tough time. There's no question about that. I don't have any. I know that Walmart is doing some stuff. There's a few others, and Walmart was not one of the companies that we would call an exemplar of conscious capitalism. Although I think that they are getting better. They used to be. It's sort of like you were saying before, Dean. They started one way, they changed, and now they're coming back. But there are definitely some companies out there that are doing the right thing, and there's a lot of companies out there that aren't. I'm some of the big unicorns, if you will, Uber and Lime are laying off thousands and thousands of people when we're not sure that there might be other ways for them to think about it.
Good. I want to invite folks who are listening, if you want to add any more questions to the chat. Here's another one. What advice would you give to entrepreneurs right now?
Yeah. So I think that if it depends on what stage you're at and where you are. Money's going to be hard to raise for the next 12 to 18 months. But if you're solving a real problem that people really care about, it doesn't have to be just in healthcare. It could be in infrastructure. It could be in anything. But I think that what we call vanity projects are going to be harder to fund, harder to get off the ground because people are going to take a different tact. I think that valuations are going to be lower than they have been in the last couple of years. So I think that my advice would be make sure that you're clear-eyed and really understanding your business model, your customers. It's a problem that people really have right now that people are looking to solve or they're going to have coming out of this. I think that one of the other things is this idea of crisis breeds innovation. Look around and say, what's not getting solved? There are plenty of problems that, we can look around now every day and say, that probably shouldn't be that way, right? So it's really about sort of taking a step back and looking at, what are the hard, intractable problems that aren't being solved right now?
There's a follow-up question on that, which ties into the short conversation you and I had before we began today about which of your companies are doing well and which of your companies are struggling. Yeah. If somebody was thinking about starting a company now in this context, which are areas you think that are absolutely ripe for this kind of problem-solving innovation?
Well, look, I think that people are going to, I think that the way that people are interact with each other is going to change. We're not going to go back out and be in really crowded spaces, jammed up against each other for a long time. I think it will come back, but it's going to take some time. So anything that, any business that is focused on, sort of in-home convenience. One of our best companies is a company called Hungry Harvest. They're a food delivery company. They can't hire people fast enough. So that those sorts of businesses. I think mobility companies, right? How do we get around electric cars? Because we're noticing, because people aren't driving as much, that we really are. It really is making a dent, an impact on pollution. So I think that autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles are going to be someplace where we think about how that's going to be, looking for innovations. I think how we communicate. We're Zoom has taken some hits. So I think that we're going to think differently about should we be getting on airplanes and going to see customers and all those sorts of things. So how we communicate, certainly anything that has to do with mobile healthcare, that's going to be a place of innovation. I think that all of those sorts of things, right? It's the things that we're seeing every day that we took for granted, right? And even some people might think that this is, one of those vanity things. But I think even how we entertain ourselves in the future is going to be different. If you think about what's his name, the drummer from the Roots is doing online DJing every night on Instagram and getting thousands of people. So what's going to be the next way that we entertain ourselves is different than it was before.
You got all the budding entrepreneurs who are listening in, you've given a whole bunch of ideas, I think, there. Thank you. Here's another question. Have you observed any companies that were that used to be conscious capitalism, or used to practice conscious capitalism, and stopped doing that? And if so, what happened to them and why?
Oh, that's a great question. What we see more often than not, and I'll put this in two different ways. When we first started the hedge fund, we had lots of turnover. And some of our customers are like, well, that doesn't seem to make sense. Like if you build a culture around this, are those companies changing? And what we found is that those companies weren't changing, that other companies were getting better and moving up the ladder. So we see that happening. I think that what we have seen from companies that were practicing conscious capitalism and stopped, usually that was because of a significant change in leadership. So a great example of that is Starbucks. Starbucks was in terms of endearment. They were, a darling of the conscious capitalism world. And then Roger Schultz left. And then they had the whole thing with the racial incidents in the stores, and the company was really taking on some water in terms of how are you dealing with both your employees, your suppliers, your customers. And then Schultz came back and said, okay, we got to rebuild the soul of this company. So we've seen that happen often. I think that's happening actually right now with Walmart. I think that, Sam Walton started the company. We didn't call it that then, but it was a really community-focused company. And that company became something different, right? And now I think it's moving back towards how can we, even if we're this behemoth and there's problems when we come to town and small businesses, how can we be more community-focused? I think that's starting to happen. So I think that you see companies they ebb and flow across this. They move in and out because of the environment, because of leadership more often than not. I think that companies, I don't have an example off the top of my head of a company that has completely gone away from the model. I think it's more, we're on a path. We're good at it for a while. We lose our way and we come back.
Kind of like human life, isn't it, in a way?
All like life, right? There's, we're trying to get away from this. And I think even, in our language, trying to get away from this notion of sinners and saints, right?
Right.
I had a friend that used to work for me, Artie Tracus, said, every saint's got a past and every sinner's got a future.
That's a good way of putting it. So we have a follow-up question from Vincent Pham, who he was the one who asked the question about your business model. And he says, conventional wisdom is that 1 out of 10 early stage companies succeed and the others fail. And he asked, can you share what percentage of companies that you invest in succeed after your 4-month training immersion program?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So far, we've invested in 30 companies. And of those 30 companies, I think 21 are still in business. whether or not you were going to call that success or not. We think that we're on path to do much better than the typical angel investor or angel fund. And a lot of that has to do with our business model, that, we spend a lot of time with those companies. I also think a lot of it has to do with that we're training them to be stakeholder-focused companies that allows them to weather some of the storms. We're not going to be perfect. We're not going to be 100%. We think that if we can do 3 in 10, that's a home run, and we may do better. Right? We may do better than that. We're encouraged.
Good, and the proof is in the pudding, right? If this is a better way of doing business, then we'll see the better results. So,
yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Here's another question. Asking, this one's from Gary Steele, asking for some examples of some of the companies which you invest in as ways of exemplifying conscious capitalism.
Yeah, so I'll start out with Hungry Harvest, which is our most successful company to date. We invested in them in 2014. We were just getting started. We were investing smaller amounts. We were $25,000 for 5% equity in Hungry Harvest. They were doing about $40,000 in revenue when we invested in them. So that's 6 years ago, right? They just closed their first Series A for $7.5 million. They're doing $15 million in revenue. They're valued at almost $49 million. And what they do, I saw when I was looking through the scroll, someone asked me about Shark Tank. I can answer that question. But Hungry Harvest was on Shark Tank. But what they do is that they buy produce from farmers and from distributors that's generally going to get thrown away and go to waste because of either aesthetics, so it's the ugly fruit movement, or because of supply chain inefficiencies. Think two loads of apples show up at Wegmans, and the Wegmans produce guy says, "I got the apples yesterday. I don't need them." And the truck driver says, "Well, I got to dump this load. Not my problem." It ends up in a waste dump. So Evans looked at that and said, "That's horrible. 6 billion pounds of produce get thrown away every year. Nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly good to eat. At the same time, there are 50 million people who are food insecure." And Evans said, maybe I can use one problem to solve the other. So he buys that produce from suppliers. It's going to get thrown away. So he buys it for pennies on the dollar. He sells it to us in a tech-enabled CSA, community-supported agriculture. And then he works with not-for-profits to get food deeper into food deserts all over the country. So that's his sort of model. When he went on Shark Tank, someone said, "You're giving away your profits." Mark Cuban said, "No, that's your marketing." That idea of helping is part of his marketing spend, and he's growing by leaps and bounds. So that's one example. Another quick example: we invested in a company called R3 Score, which was started by a woman who went to prison for white-collar financial crime and came out of prison a couple of years later. She's an MBA. She's very accomplished professional. Couldn't get a job, couldn't get a loan for a house, and couldn't get her life back together. And she said, does anybody want to be judged on their worst day for the rest of their lives? And the way that we think about returning citizens, that's what we do. And we're going to have something like 70 or 80 million people incarcerated. Maybe the number's even larger than that. Some of those people incarcerated for nonviolent crimes come out and try to get their life back together. But the way that we think about them as a risk prevents them from doing that. So she's created a model that allows banks and hiring managers to understand those people in the context of their whole life and to help them get back on their feet and back into performing in society. And banks particularly are leaving billions of dollars on the table because they're supposed to be making loans, and these are a whole section of our society that they don't know how to manage the risk. So Teresa has created a better model to help them understand risk and is getting more money into their hands and getting people's lives turned around and making banks more profitable at the same time.
That's really cool. Our Sioka Center for Principled Entrepreneurship, which you know well, works with one company in the District of Columbia that is an office cleaning company that is owned and operated entirely by returning citizens. All the owners, every employee, and so on. Trying to attack from a different angle exactly that same issue. So
there's a great company in Yonkers, New York, called Grayston Bakery. They do something really interesting. It's open hiring. So it's just, if you want a job, all you do is walk into the office. There's a list at the front door. You put your name on the list, and the next job that comes up is yours. There's no interview. There's no background check. It's, my friend Mike Brady, who used to run Grayson, used to always say, we don't hire people to make brownies. We make brownies so we can hire people. And they have created a whole system in that business that to support those people, because look, if you come to us, you want a job, we're pretty sure that you're coming because you can't find a job someplace else, but we're going to create a system. Instead of creating a system of background checks and interviews to weed people out, we spent that money on creating a system to support people who really want a job. Yeah. So it's a really interesting idea.
That's a great one. That is a great one.
Yeah.
So you alluded to this one. Chris asks, what's your opinion of Shark Tank?
So it's television. That's the first thing you have to remember. I think that there's a lot that you can learn from Shark Tank. And if you ever talk to Evan Lutz, the CEO of Hungry Harvest, I think that, we spent weeks with him, grilling him on his pitch. And the one thing that we focused on more than anything else was know your numbers. So if nothing else you can learn from Shark Tank, know your numbers. They're going to ask you about your margins. They're going to ask you about, how much does this thing cost? They know you're going to ask you about your sales. They know you're going to ask you about customer acquisition. So it's television. It's, it's not all that you see, but that's for real. That if you go on the show and you know your numbers and you know your numbers cold, that you got a much better chance of getting a deal. And it's the same thing out in the world with regular investors, right? Shark Tank's done an amazing thing for entrepreneurship. It's also, in some ways, can be detrimental because everyone's not cut out for entrepreneurship, and that's okay, right? The entertainment of it makes more people want to get into it, and that's okay too. But you have to sort of understand whether that's really the thing for you. So I watch Shark Tank. I watch it because, it gives me, I like it, it's entertaining, but it also gives you a view into what other investors really care about.
Great, thank you. Here's an offbeat question. The writer says the question is from Coach Gutelius, who maybe you remember, wants to know if you ever owned a bar on 19th Street.
I don't know who that writer is, but he's probably a lawyer, because it's one of those where you don't ask a question that you don't already know the answer to. Yes, indeed I did. Coach Gut knows that as well. I did own a bar on 19th Street called the Acme Bar and Grill.
Very good. All right. Was that one of your earlier experiences in entrepreneurship?
It was indeed. It was I had I was doing the consulting company at the same time.
Wow.
It was as you might imagine, it was a big Catholic U hangout.
That's great. Okay. Here's one that's asking, what book/blog/podcast do you recommend for those interested in conscious capitalism, entrepreneurship, angel investing?
Yeah, great question. So obviously, we love Raj Sisodia and the books that he's written. So Conscious Capitalism, the book itself, he's Firms of Endearment, which was the first book, and I guess we can put these up on the chat. Mm-hmm. Raj just wrote a new book called The Healing Organization, which is a great book that I'm in the midst of reading. I think it's great. I like Simon Sinek's work, so I like Start With Why, which I think is great. There's a book, this book here, The Infinite Game is another one of Simon's books that's really well done that I've been offering to a lot of people. So those are a few. My partner, Joe McClinsky, wrote a book, has written a couple of books. One is called Grow Regardless, which I think is a really, really excellent read, fast and excellent read. And another one called Shift the Work, our idea about Shift Ventures and Shift Consulting, which we changed our name to, is about how do we shift the purpose of business. So those are all good. As far as blogs and podcasts, I would go on Medium and just search entrepreneurship and angel investing. There's a ton of great stuff on Medium. And then podcasts, my partner Joe does a podcast called Shift to Work. I really like that. I like Tim Ferriss's podcast from the 4-Hour Work Week. I really like his stuff. And I really I think for a general overview about the economy and investing is Make Me Smart by Kai Ryssdal from NPR. I think that's a great podcast.
Thank you. We'll get these posted up either in the chat thing or at the end of your talk. So here's what may be our last question. It's the last question I have right now on the chat, and that is, and I don't think it's a fair question because who could answer this? But let me ask it to you anyway, which is, how long do you think it's going to take the economy to get back to normal?
No idea. I mean, if we don't have a vaccine or antivirals, it's going to be a long time. I think it could be back to normal. It could be 24 months. I don't think we'll be, shelter in place for that long. I hope.
God forbid. Yeah.
None of us could take it.
No.
I think to get back to par where we were before, it's going to take a long time, and it's going to look different.
There was one other question that came that I think you answered, but I think some people might have missed it. September 13, 1970, in case they missed it.
Oh, yeah. So that was the date that Milton Friedman wrote his famous or infamous article in the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times Magazine about the corporate social responsibility of business. Good.
Yeah. I think Samantha's going to be posting a poll to get feedback. But let us be wrapping up. Any final words of advice or encouragement, Jeff, to our students and to all of our observers?
Well, first of all, Dean, thank you for having me. This has been great. I'm sorry we couldn't do it live like we planned, but I hope it was valuable. And at least a little bit entertaining. Thanks, Samantha, for doing such great work and pulling this all together. And thank all of you for joining and for great questions. It was very engaging for me. I think that the final thing I would say is that you're connected to an amazing institution, and the things that, Dean, you're doing at the Bush School, and we're going to try to do together in the future, and this notion of connecting business more acutely to Catholic social teachings and, and sort of humanity is going to be the future of business. So I would just say, stay the course for all of you. If you're connected to us, stay the course. It's not easy, but it's the right way to go, and it's going to make an economy that works for all of us. And I think that's all that we could ask for.
Very good. Well, Jeff, listen, thank you so much. It was you put the whole story together so beautifully. It tied it all so nicely, and you're working every day to make conscious capitalism come more alive. So we really appreciate that, and we will have you back when it's possible to do it live and face to face. So thanks, and stay safe.
I'll look forward to that. You too. Stay safe, everyone.
Bye-bye. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Good night.